thanks to all of you for being here tonight. I'm grateful for those of you who have come out to talk about some of these things. I've titled what we're going to do tonight, Turning Points, and I'll talk a little bit more about precisely what I mean by that in just a moment. But I'd like to start off with prayer. Let's bow. Gracious God, we thank you for giving us a heritage of people who have loved your name. We thank you for the history, the stories that inspire and sometimes instruct us about how not to live our lives. And yet we realize in some way all of these have brought us to where we are today. Please bless us in our conversation tonight. Please help this not to be simply a matter of getting some information, but may the things we think about and talk about be part of the way that you're transforming us more into the image of Christ. Through Christ we pray. Amen. Amen. Statistically, whenever you get a group of people together of this size, it's very rare to have someone not to have someone in the audience who has either direct contact in their own family or with someone that they know who's suffering from some sort of memory loss through dementia. My wife Linda has a dear friend who has had Alzheimer's for some time. She works with the Alzheimer's Association. We've done the Alzheimer's Walk. Most people in the Western world today have in their own family or know someone who is suffering from a loss of memory or dementia. Now, generally speaking, I'm asking this particular question rhetorically. You know what that means? It means I'm not asking for a verbal response, but I'm asking you to think about a response right now. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is it a good thing or a bad thing to lose your history, to lose your memory, to lose part of who you are? Most of us would say it's a bad thing. Why would people say it is bad to lose your memory? It is bad to lose your history, either as an individual or as a group of people? It's because it defines who we are. To a great extent, it actually gives us our identity. My mother is suffering from dementia. There are different forms of it, but she has lost her short-term memory. She knows us. She loves us. She loves us to be with her. But there are pieces of that memory where she just simply doesn't have the full identity, and it's a tragic thing. I think that one of the things that is so astounding to me, and I'm a historian, all right, and I know a lot of people, probably not you, because if you thought this, you wouldn't be here, right? A lot of people, and I was one of them at one time, believe that history is generally pretty boring and pretty irrelevant. It's not something that really makes a lot of difference to who we are today, to how we live our lives as Christians. As a church historian, as specifically a church historian, I would say that knowing something about our history, how we have been formed, how we have gotten our identity, how we have come to where we are today, is actually a spiritual discipline. Now, one time I was teaching a class in South America, and I was waxing eloquent on how important it was to know our history, our religious history, our spiritual history. And at the break, a lady came up to me and she said, "Do you mean that we have to know church history to be saved?" And I said, "No, that's not the point. Christ, through the work that he did on the cross, and the grace of God, and our faith in that, and our response to it, that's what saves. But you know, as we grow, as we mature, as we become grounded, as we become more experienced in the faith, I believe, I'm thoroughly convinced that one of the things that is an important spiritual discipline is the learning of how we've come to be what we are. I remember that passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, where Paul is giving the Corinthian church a history lesson. We're not going to read that whole passage, but he goes on through a long series of events throughout the history of the people of God, and he tells them about being in the wilderness and being led by the pillar of cloud and fire, and going through the sea, and all the things that he reminds them of. And at several places in that first part of the chapter, verses 1 through 10 in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, he says, these things were written down for you to instruct you, to remind you. And when he comes to the end of this section, it says, these things happened to them to serve as an example, and they were written down to instruct us, on whom the ends of the ages have come. And the next verse to me is the clincher. In the King James it says, therefore. I always think in the King James because I learned that when I was young. Therefore, so, if you think you are standing, take heed, watch out, that you do not fall. He says that at the end of a history lesson. What I think he's saying is that if you don't know, if you can't learn from the things that have happened before, the things that have been written down, and let me tell you folks, God's work in the lives of people did not end in the first century. It did not. You know that. The people of God have continued to act and to do and to write about their experiences and about their beliefs. I'm absolutely convinced that if we do not know that history, now that it's extended from the time when Paul was writing to this very day, we can become quite arrogant. We can become quite sure that we know all we need to know, and we don't need to know anything about anybody else, and we're the right folks, and we've got everything together, and we figured it all out. And if you're not exactly with me, then obviously you don't get it. You're not right. And he says, if you think you're standing, that is precisely the place where you are in most danger. If you think you're right, you're ignorant of your history in this case, and you think that everything is okay. I'm standing. I can critique everyone else. He says that's precisely the place where you're most in danger of falling. So, what I want to do, what I'd like for us to do together tonight, and this is from a brilliant church historian as we move closer to the first one of these turning points. Justo Gonzalez, in my opinion, was one of the greatest church historians still living. But he wrote a book that was so good. It was just a wonderful church history book. People would I'm going to move out of the thing just for a second because I'm going to turn the heat down. Okay? Sorry. I find that it's better if students are slightly cold, they stay awake a little bit. Otherwise your face starts, I can see it in the eyes. Gonzalez wrote this book that people would buy just to read because it was a good book, not because they were taking a church history course. I used his books for many years in my undergraduate church history classes. But he says some things in the preface that I thought were so good, and I would put some of this material up here tonight. When we stand or sit or kneel in church, when we sing a hymn, recite a creed, or refuse to recite one, when we build a church or preach a sermon, a past of which we may not be aware, is one of the factors influencing our actions. The notion that we read the New Testament exactly as the early Christians did, without any weight of tradition coloring our interpretation, is an illusion. It is also a dangerous illusion, for it tends to absolutize our interpretation, confusing it with the Word of God. That's what Paul was saying in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. If we do not know these things, there's a tremendous temptation to think we've got it all together, we're standing, and to be arrogant and to be condemnatory of others. One way we can avoid this danger is to know the past that colors our vision. A person wearing tinted glasses can avoid the conclusion that the entire world is tinted only by being conscious of the glasses. Tinted glasses, you know, like sunglasses. Sometimes they're colored kind of red or green or blue. And if you don't think, you don't even realize you're wearing the glasses, everything looks a certain way, and you think, well, that's just the way everybody sees it. To be aware that you have them is important. You can only, to conclude that everybody should see or does see it the same way you do, you have to be conscious otherwise of the glasses themselves. Likewise, if we're to break free from an undue bondage to tradition, we must begin by understanding what that tradition is, how we came to be where we are, and how particular elements in our past color our view of the present. I would slightly disagree with Brother Gonzalez, because you might get the impression that, well, okay, now I know I have these glasses on, and so I can simply take them off, and then I can see perfectly. It's more like permanent contacts. I don't know, maybe it's like you've got those contacts in. You don't take them out, but if you know you have them, you are more humble. I'm teaching a church history class here at the college right now. There are several who are in the class. And the first day we talked about why study church history. Well, a lot of folks have heard things, why study history, learn from the past, etc., etc. Well, we don't learn from the past, really, not too much. But that's one of the things that's always said. I would say one important reason that we study church history is to make us humble or humble. When we realize that we have a perspective, and it's not a bad thing, it's a human thing. We are human beings. But when we realize that we have that perspective, then we can be more humble, we can be more, or less, I should say, less judgmental. We can try to understand others and where they've come from and how they've been shaped. And you know, like I said, I believe that learning our church history is a spiritual discipline. We're the only one of God's creatures that can do this, folks. I mean, you can train dogs to do certain things, and I know that some people who love dogs and animals, I've known people who thought that the dogs could actually do more than I think they can as far as their mental processes. And you can train animals to do certain things through various ways of repeating things and rewarding things. But we're the only ones who have this capacity to come to know how we've been shaped as a people, how those ideas and events have made us who we are. And so that, I would say, the spiritual historical consciousness is part of our spiritual maturity. Now, let me explain briefly why I'm using this term, turning points. Several years ago, Martin Noble, who is a great church historian also, wrote a book called Turning Points, where he takes some of the major events in Christian history and uses that as the way that he takes people through church history. So decisive moments in the history of Christianity. Those who are in the class with me know that there's a lot of stuff to go over. We have gone 2 solid weeks, and we're barely getting to where we can get a sense of some of the major things. But Martin Noll says, I think it's legitimate to do it this way, that is to study church history from certain major turning points, because it allows us to extract a few striking incidents to bring order to a massively complicated subject. It provides an opportunity to highlight and linger over specific moments to show complexity and humanity. Folks, these people are just like you and me. They're imperfect. They're struggling. In many cases, they're trying to figure out, how should I construct my life? How should I live my life? How should I do it in a way that follows Christ? But their complexity and humanity. And it provides an opportunity to interpret why certain events marked an important fork. And so what I've done tonight is to look at we're going to look briefly at 3 major turning points. There are a lot. I've chosen 3. Other people would choose others, but we're going to start off with Constantine. or Constantine, some people say. Constantine and the Council of Nicaea. Then we'll jump 1,200 years to the Protestant Reformation, and then we'll end with the 20th century with missions, unity, and globalization. So that's what we're going to do. Okay. Let's start then with Constantine and the Council of Nicaea. You all should have a handout. Does everyone have a copy of the handout if you want to take notes or you want to follow the general outline? Are there more copies of that? If you don't have a copy, Rosie can get you a copy quickly. When the Christians began to be distinguished from the Jews were allowed in the Roman Empire. Everyone else was required to, by this time, be part of what was called the emperor cult. It was basically what we would do today, at least in some countries, is you say the Pledge of Allegiance to your flag. You say the Pledge of Allegiance to your country. That means you're a loyal citizen. That means that you're supporting the government. And the emperor cult, we would call it, or worshiping the emperor, was part of sort of saying, yes, I pledge allegiance to the Roman Empire that's represented in the emperor. And I sacrifice this, and I get my certificate to say, I am a loyal citizen of the Roman Empire. Now the Jews were about the only ones that were exempt from that. The Jews had given the Romans a lot of problems. So the Jews worked out a deal with the Romans to say, you can do these sacrifices for the whole Jewish people, so individual Jews didn't have to. And as long as the Christians were understood to be Jews, which they were at first, all of them were Jews, early Christians were. As long as the Romans just viewed the Christians as a sect of Jews, like Sadducees or Pharisees or Essenes or others, then they were under that umbrella. But once it became clear by both the Jews and many Christians that we're not Jewish, they became illegal. Because the Christians would not sacrifice to the emperor. They did not participate in the things that showed that you're a loyal citizen. How do you show that you're a loyal citizen in your country? This is not a rhetorical question. I don't know.
Cheer on the All Blacks.
Cheer on the All Blacks.
Number one.
That's pretty pagan practice, I would say.
Pay your taxes.
Pay your taxes, okay. Again, there's certain ceremonies in the United States. They have these ceremonies where you stand and the flag is there and I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, etc., etc. One God, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I mean, that's the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, okay? That's the kind of thing. How do you show your loyalty to the government? The Christians won't do it. And so they're persecuted. This is an early mosaic from Rome, probably from a building that was used as a church, showing some of the kinds of persecution that Christians faced in the gladiator and the arenas, where they would bring Christians in and set them out and then turn wild animals on them, and the gladiators also would come out and kill them. But you can see there's a lion that's attacked this Christian who's bleeding, he's biting him in the face. Another one is the same kind of thing, where they tied these people up and set leopards on them. Now, the Christians became massively persecuted, and they began to spread, and they actually eventually spread throughout the entire Roman Empire and beyond. But something happened. This is the story that is told. The Emperor Constantine, in fact, I might just have Daniel Kinney stand and give a short lecture on Constantine and how he changed things. Would you be willing to do that? He knows it all, but I won't embarrass him. Constantine's mother was a Christian. Constantine is the emperor. His father had been a major official in the Roman Empire. There had been a reorganization of the Roman Empire to east and west, and there was a top person and a second person. And Constantine's father had been the second person in the Western Empire. And but he was a military man. He was a general, and so Constantine, who has been sort of under house arrest in the east of the Roman Empire, escapes and comes over to meet his dad. And what is today York in England, it was the Roman province of Britannia. And the troops loved his dad. His dad was named Constantius. So you've got Constantius, and the son is Constantine, named after the father. But his father dies. And Constantine also he had been trained in the east by the Roman emperor in that part of the country, that part of the nation, in that part of the Roman Empire, I should say. And so he was a great military leader as well, and the troops proclaimed him emperor. But there's still another guy over here who claims to be emperor. If you've ever watched any of those movies on television about, I don't know, Game of Thrones or any of those, it's always fighting who's going to be on top, and this is what's going on. And Constantine begins to move from Britain back across the Roman Empire, and he's about to have a major battle not far from the city of Rome with his rival. And this is in the year 314. And so way before this crucial battle, this is a story that's told later by Constantine. It's told as to sort of explain how he believed he came into power, because eventually he will become the emperor of the entire Roman Empire. It all comes back together under him. He says that the night before the big battle at this bridge, it's sort of the Milvian Bridge it's called, he sees a sign in the heavens. Can you see? You can't really, well, you can see a little bit of it. Does this have a pointer? Is this a pointer? I can't tell. It's a pointer. Anyway, you see it up there at the top? It's a cross. And according to the story, he sees this cross in the sky and these words, in hoc signo vincis, that's Latin, in this sign you shall win or conquer. So actually that night, he has all of the banner holders, the Roman emperor, the Roman armies would have symbols of the Roman Empire. And normally it would have been some sort of imperial symbol with an eagle and so forth like this. But he changes all of those flags, all of those symbols that would have been held up at the beginning, at the front ranks of each of the units of soldiers to a cross. And he wins. And he becomes the emperor, the sole emperor of the Roman Empire. There's a little bit more to the story, but the bottom line is he legalizes Christianity. It's the first time it's been legalized. He becomes, in some sense, and you can criticize him for a lot of things, because he doesn't make it the only legal religion. I mean, he's the Roman emperor. He still has to uphold loyalty to the Roman government. He still has to, even himself as the emperor, he still has to be involved in the rites and rituals and traditions of the Roman Empire, right? That's going to be part of his job as the emperor, so to speak. But he makes it legal, and he seems to favor it. He seems to like it. His mother was a Christian. She becomes very important in some of the story as well. Regardless of how you might see Constantine's move, some people have just said, oh, he's just trying to say there are a lot of Christians and I need to get the empire on the same page, and these people will support me if I make Christianity legal. So you can judge him as saying, I'm just doing this as a political move. But regardless of how you say it, he does make Christianity legal. He does change the landscape completely as far as Christians are concerned. He does set the stage for Christianity over time to become the dominant religion of all of what we now call Europe, Eastern and Western, and in Northern Africa. That's the whole Roman Empire, the extent of the Roman Empire. Now, Constantine comes into power, and he is, especially when he gets back over into the east, he renames an old city called Byzantium. He renames it after himself. Constantinople, names after himself. Does anybody know what it's called today? Istanbul, yeah. There's another set of events with the Islamic peoples that happens later, but he is in this area, and he is absolutely astounded. He's thinking that the church, the Christians, are going to support him, and this is going to help stability in the empire. What he finds is that the Christians are out in the streets rioting against each other over a doctrinal matter. And Christians don't do that today. Right? We're all in harmony with one another, and we're all on the same page today doctrinally. Now, what they were arguing about was the nature of God. There was a large discussion, and a serious discussion among Christians about how can we worship Christ. If we only believe in one God, and we're worshiping the one true God, the Father, the Creator, but we're also worshiping Christ. So it seems like we're worshiping two gods. What's going on? And then there's something else. The Holy Spirit, they didn't quite know what to do with the Holy Spirit as far as getting a conception of it all. So there was a preacher, a very prominent and good preacher apparently. He made up jingles for his congregation to sing, to remember doctrinal points. And he had made up some phrases, some jingles for the church. There, he was in Alexandria, Egypt, is where he was the preacher. And he basically said this. And he's trying to figure it out himself. He's struggling to figure this out. How can we worship Christ and worship the God the Father and still just believe in one God? He said, well, what this is, Christ is the first thing that was created by God. He goes to the Scripture. He understands this in a way that I think it's wrong, but he says, it says that Christ is the firstborn of all creation. And then through Christ, everything else that was created was created. Well, it says that in Colossians. What does that mean precisely? He's saying it means that Christ is a created being. That there was a time when Christ did not exist. And other Christians are saying, no, we can't go along with that. He thought, the man's name was Arius. This is the jingle, as it gets translated into English, was, there was a time when he was not. It's not so great in the jingle. At least it doesn't come through in English so well. But there was a time when he was not. So it's not a problem. But he was so perfectly in line with the will of God that God has elevated him to be worthy of worship, and so we can worship. But he's not the same as God. He's not equal to God. He came into existence at a certain point. He's not co-eternal with God. And others, the person who was then by then called the Bishop of Alexandria, and again this is in the early 300s, he said, we can't go along with that. Christ is not a created being. But they're struggling. But I mean, listen folks, people were literally out in the streets fighting with each other, burning buildings over which was right, the Arian view or the Alexander was the guy who was the bishop. Alexander of Alexandria. But you were on Alexander's side or you were on Arius' side. And Constantine comes in and he sees, wait a minute, I thought the Christians were going to be all on the same page and we're going to actually make the empire more stable, and you're making it less stable. You people have to get your act together. You have to come to agreement. And so Constantine, the emperor, not a church official, but a government official, calls a council, and he says, you bring all these bishops, all these leaders of the church, all these theologians together, and you're going to decide what is the right teaching about Christ being God, the nature of God. I mean, they're struggling with this. How do we see this? Somehow they saw three persons, and so these are different ways that artistically through the years people have tried to depict it. So you've got an older man, a younger man, and something else, a dove. That's Father, Son, Holy Spirit. You've got another depiction of this one being with three faces. That's kind of strange. But again, they're struggling with this. What would eventually be called the Trinity. How do you make sense of all that? And so forth. Constantine presides over the Council of Nicaea in 325. And some of these church leaders, these bishops as they call them, they've been in the persecution. Some of these guys were limping in because they had their legs broke. Some of them were coming in with their eyes having been poked out because they were tortured for the faith. And Constantine gives them an all-expense-paid trip to a city near Constantinople, Nicaea, gives them robes, puts them in what we call it resort hotel rooms, gives them food to eat. Some of these old men especially could not believe what was happening. Constantine says, you come together and you get this straight. You figure out what you believe about this. This is a great picture. It's St. Nicholas, who was a supporter. Later on, there was another guy named Athanasius, who was a very strong Trinitarian. But this is a great picture of St. Nicholas punching out the heretic Arius. Well, yeah, eventually he would, through a series of strange things, known for that. He's certainly not known for that in those days. But it was a real conflict. Now here's the question. The Council of Nicaea decides that there is one essence of God. It's just this again, I'm going to try to be as clear as I can, but they talk about this one essence of God. That's all there is. And that God the Father has all of that essence, and God the Son has all of that essence too. Jesus is of the same essence, not part of it. It's not like they took part of the essence of God over here and okay, that's Jesus. No, he is of the same 100% divine essence too. And the Holy Spirit as well. That's the way they tried to explain it. Whether or not they explained it perfectly, they were holding on to the full divinity of Christ and the unity of God. There's just one God. Now, why is this significant for Christian faith then and today? Think about what we've talked about. Constantine coming into the picture. There was a slide back here, a couple of slides back. He would be the first Roman emperor to profess Christianity, not only starting the process that would make the empire into a Christian state, but providing the impulse for a distinctively Christian culture that would develop in Europe. That's very important. He presides over one of the most significant councils in the history of the church to decide a doctrinal point. It's not simply a matter of having some propositions in your head. It actually has something to do with the way that you believe in Christ and the way that you worship and regard Christ and the way that you shape your life after Christ, if you understand it. What's the significance of that for then and today? Well, I have some ideas about that, but I'm going to ask you to turn to your neighbor and spend about 3 minutes saying, what do you think is important about this for Christianity today? It had a large impact on Christianity in its own day, with Constantine coming in. I just want you to think about it. 3 minutes. Talk to your neighbor in groups of 2 or 3. Just talk to each other in groups of 2 or 3. And then I want to hear what you say, and then I'll tell you what I think. Okay? 3 minutes. All right, let's come back together as a group of the whole. Let's come back together as a group of the whole. I'd like to see 3 hands of someone who would tell the best idea you heard, not what you said, what you heard your conversation partner or partners say. 3 hands. I want to see 3 hands of people who are willing to tell what they heard just now, the best idea you heard. Number 1, thank you, Michael. Who else? Number 2, thank you, in the back. Let's have the 3rd hand.
Give me a 3.
Thank you. Number 3. Number 1. What did you hear?
What did you hear? Oh, I thought you was
No, you have to explain it.
Let me tell what you I take my hand back.
We don't have all night now. You want to do it? Okay.
Right.
You want to take over? Okay.
Yeah.
What did you hear?
Well, that was the dark ages, so the scriptures weren't really expressed to everybody at that point in time. And the significance of this, of Constantine, was that we would have probably been like, maybe they had the belief of Jehovah's Witnesses today, or the belief of some other, form of religion, whereas Christ was not a divine being.
Okay, yeah, you're definitely picking up on the piece that the Christian consensus reflected in Scripture, which they did have, was that Christ is fully divine. Now, there's another question that will come along a little later, which we're not talking about tonight, is how is he fully human, too? Yeah, you guys know all about that in the class. But you definitely have a focus on a doctrinal understanding that's not just a matter of curiosity or a matter of, it's fun to talk about, we can pursue this or speculate about that. It has to do with the very nature of Christianity itself. Is Christ fully divine? And so there's a focus on a doctrinal point that has importance. Who was number 2 in the back? Yes. Yeah, you've got 2 important points here. The first one is that persecution is ended. That has implications at a lot of levels, and that's one of the things that I want to say that I think is really an important piece. But it also has this whole business of putting together, in some sense, the society and the church. Society and church, or church and state, perhaps you can talk about that. Those things come together, and it becomes sort of a whole. That slide back a couple of slides ago, the way it says it provides, and it makes the empire into a, quote, Christian state, but it provides an impulse for a distinctively Christian culture. So it begins to pervade, in some way, the empire. Good. Who was number 3?
I was number 3.
Yes, thank you.
I don't know whether I should be number 3. No, I've been brought up to believe, well, I don't know, I didn't go back in history, but we were all brought up, or I was, that 3 persons, God, 3 persons, blessed Son, you know.
Trinity, that's right.
Trinity,
Yes.
yeah. So, no doubt about it.
Yeah, that has become, again, that would become the consensus in those days as well as today. It's interesting that doctrinal point becomes so central and so important. So here's what I would say. We continue to hold to that, although I'm not sure many people understand it. I'm not sure that's the point, to understand it in some sort of propositional way, a full intellectual way.
Faith.
Yeah, and the point of it is, the point of the doctrine of the Trinity is that God existed fully before anything else. I mean, God was always. It's hard to even use the terminology that's good enough. But that God, even before, God is love.
Mm-hmm.
Love must have an object. Somehow there was actually love going on within God before anything else, because of the very nature of God. I think that's part of the point of the Trinity. God is inherently relational, and therefore, as we become followers of God, we in turn. There's a whole lot more to say about it. I would say that there is a focus on doctrine, getting doctrine precise, and I don't think that's a bad thing, but I definitely think it becomes a major focus. But you said something back there about now it's legal. In fact, it looks like Constantine actually is favoring Christianity. Again, it's a little iffy as to whether or not everybody would call him a Christian. He's not baptized until he's on his deathbed. Now that wasn't totally uncommon in those days, because some people thought if you sinned after baptized, there was no forgiveness for sin after baptism, so you wait till the last minute so you make sure you get out. He continues to be the emperor and observe Roman traditions because he's the emperor, right? So, but he favors Christianity. Now, before Constantine, if you became a Christian, you were literally taking your life into your hand. You did not do this flippantly or to get ahead in the world. You did it because you were convicted. You were convinced that Jesus Christ is the Savior, is the Messiah, is the one who can bring us to a relationship with God that is salvific. It saves us. But you're taking your life into your hand because it's illegal. And a lot of Christians died, and a lot of Christians, we talked about those bishops that were called to the Council of Nicaea, many of them were maimed and crippled and blind because of their faith. Now, the emperor likes Christians. If I want to get ahead, it might be a good thing for me to be a Christian. If I want to move ahead in the world, if I want to get a good government job, if I want to have a position that would be favorable to the government, this might be the thing to do, is to become a Christian. And there are a lot of folks who become Christians, apparently, not because they're convicted deeply in a saving relationship with Christ, but because it becomes an advantageous thing to do. And there are a lot of Christians who have been in Christianity for a while who say, the church is becoming weak, the church is becoming polluted, and they pulled away, not from the church, but they said, we have to be examples. We can't be martyrs anymore because nobody's being killed for their faith, but we can be a different kind of martyr. And they became monastics. They separated themselves from the world and they lived lives of holiness and study and prayer. So this is the beginning of Christian monasticism in a larger way. Not that there have not been some who've done it before. Again, there's an attitude here, an attitude of reform, an attitude that you see coming throughout the rest of the history of Christianity. when things get askew, when things get out of whack, when things get so that people who are professed Christians don't really understand or don't seem to understand what Christianity is even all about. What is the point of Christianity? What is the point of Christianity? You know, if I were to answer that question from my experience in a lot of cases, I would say that the point of Christianity is to create a bunch of uptight, mean-spirited, condemnatory people who are always on everybody else's back if they're not doing what they think that they should do. If I thought that's what Christianity was, then I would be saying I don't want anything to do with Christianity. I think the point of Christianity, and that's what you begin to see even in this, and you see it well before this period, but you see it in the minds of reformers throughout Christian history, is to shape us into the image of Christ. If we are in Christ, if we are Christians, if we have God's Holy Spirit that's promised, in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, it says we're being transformed from one degree to another, more to the image of Christ. And that's what Christians in these days would have said if they really pointed to what the point of Christianity is. It's not having a bunch of doctrinal propositions that you can say yes to. Are doctrines important? Yes, but they are not the point. Doctrines are to get us to the point of being transformed into the image of Christ, which I think in a shorthand way can be described in Philippians chapter 2, willing to give, remember the passage, Philippians 2? Christ, though in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped or held on to, but willingly gave it up for others. I think that's the image of Christ. And it's characterized by the fruit of the Spirit: love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and gentleness. I've seen a lot of Christians who are more characterized by the work of the flesh. Quarrels and jealousy and fighting and dissension and divisions. And they think they're doing it in the name of Christ. That's what happened when people were out in the street fighting over the doctrine of the Trinity. Is the doctrine of the Trinity important? I think it is. But not because you got the right proposition in your head. It's because when you understand who God is, it transforms you to love other people, to give yourself for other people. Constantine's a mixed bag, folks. Constantine's a mixed bag. Point 2. Jump 1,200 years. Martin Luther. Martin Luther is another one of those folks who says there are things that are not right about the church. There are some abuses that are taking place where people have missed the point of what Christianity is really all about. He's a Roman Catholic priest. He's a doctor of theology. He's one of the most educated people in the Roman Catholic Church in what we would call today Germany. But he is so hurt, so disgusted by what he sees as corruption among leaders who are more interested in getting position and power and money for themselves than they are in helping people be transformed into the image of Christ. And one of the things that was happening was priests very often and bishops would sell religious services. Now, we say sell. They didn't say sell. You give a donation to the church and we give you something in return. So it's not selling it. But part of what had developed through the Roman Catholic medieval church was, and again, please don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. I'm not saying these are all wicked, evil people and that we should discount them and say they're not even Christians. What I'm saying is that there were, just like today, there were imperfect people who were struggling to figure out what's right. And there were some leaders, many leaders, that were abusing the system that had developed. They believed that the church had the treasury of merit. The church, when Christ died, the church received a treasury of merit. Because Christ didn't owe anything. Christ was not sinful. Christ died as a totally innocent person. And when Christ died, therefore, he created merit that can be applied to you to forgive you of sins. That's the idea that it developed. There are a lot of things to critique about it. In some ways, it's reflected in the idea of the perfection of Christ and the forgiveness of Christ. But what was happening is that there was a guy who was the Pope in Rome at the time, and he was wanting to build a big new cathedral, which we have to this day in Rome, St. Peter's Basilica, and he needed the money. And so they were going to have, especially in Germany, this is my Protestant anti-Catholicism coming through. They were going to have a special indulgence so that you could give a donation to the church as an act of penance, and then you would be given a certificate that would forgive you or someone else of sins. Now, the Roman Catholic Church actually never taught that. You couldn't get forgiveness for somebody else, but the guy who was selling them, a German priest called Johann or John, we would say John, Tetzel, he was out to make as much money as he could, and he was telling people, you can buy stuff, you can do this. He wouldn't say buy. You give a donation to the church, and we can actually forgive the sins of relatives, even relatives who have gone on. Well, the Roman Catholic Church never taught that. And when they found out, actually, that he was teaching it, they actually they kicked him out and put him in jail for 2 years. Made him do penance, Johann Tetzel. But he's selling them, and he's saying that. And Martin Luther has some of his... Martin Luther is the preacher at the Wittenberg Church. Wittenberg is a city in Germany where he lived and where he worked. He was the preacher, he was a teacher at the seminary or Bible college there. And he has some of his folks going across the river where Tetzel's selling indulgences, quote, shouldn't say sell, where people are being given indulgences for donations to the church, and he sees these things and he says, this is absurd, this is wrong, this is not right, these are just worthless pieces of paper. And he writes a set of propositions about indulgences. They're called the 95 Theses. We looked at some of those in class the other day. He basically is saying that a person, every individual Christian, has access to forgiveness without having to have any kind of indulgences. If you repent and you truly want to live a Christian life and you repent, you've got forgiveness. You don't have to go get an indulgence and pay money to the church. Well, guess what? The 95 Theses were written in Latin. It was supposed to be a debate between him and some other university professors. Somebody who spoke Latin and German, by the way, he nailed it to the door of the church because that was the notice board. In those days, look, I mean, you got all kind of notices, you know. Potluck next Saturday, bring your best dish, so-and-so is going to have a sale of extra furniture if you need anything. I mean, there's the notice board for the church. So he takes that, in the university, he takes his 95 Theses, nailed them up there, and says, I want to debate this with anybody who wants to come along. But it's in Latin, and nobody can read it except people who are actually pretty learned. But somebody comes along and reads it, and he says, wow, this is good stuff. You don't need to get indulgences. All you need is to truly repent and get forgiveness from Christ. You don't have to go through some priest or anything else. This is good stuff. And so he writes it, actually takes it off the door and takes it off and translates it into German, the ordinary language that people live. And in that part of the world, literacy was fairly high. It was not 50%, but it was fairly high. A lot of places, hardly anyone read, but in that part there was a middle class that was growing, emergence, and people had education. And so the printing press had just come into existence in Europe. Now the Chinese had had a printing press for some time. Okay? We don't ever talk about that. But in Europe, there was a German guy, not too far from there, named John Gutenberg, who invented the printing press. So in the old days, if you wanted to have something to spread around or copy to print, I mean, you just had to literally sit there and copy it. And it would take a long time and it would take a lot of money. Now you've got these printing presses where you can set up type and you can put ink on this thing and boom, 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 print them off. And they start printing these things. There's no copyright law in those days. So printers, if they wanted to, they could make money off anything before copyright laws. And they start going at it, and it's just really catching fire. And Tetzel's sales go way down. And the Catholic Church begins to respond to him. He's called up there through a series of events. He's called before, everybody sort of starts laughing, and they say, the diet of worms, did they eat worms? No, it's not what we're talking about at all. The diet was the German Parliament. It just means all of the princes and dukes and counts and so forth that were in the German states. They were sort of like a German parliament. And they met at the German city of Worms. It looks like worms, right? So they summons Martin Luther to kind of a trial at the Diet of Worms. And by this time, this is a few years after the 95 Theses, he has written a bunch of stuff, brilliant material. He talks about the fact that every Christian no Christian has to go through anyone else to get to Christ, the priesthood of all believers. He's talking about the fact that if the nobility, who are really Christians, who understand at least in some sense better than some of these corrupt Catholic leaders, he's not saying Catholics are not Christians, he's saying there are some leaders that have messed things up. The nobles ought to get those church leaders out. Whoa, revolution. And so they call him, and they put all of his writings out on a table. The Catholic folks who called him had already planned this, right? Luther thinks he's being summoned to debate his propositions, to explain his beliefs. But they said, we don't want him to talk. Just get him down there, put all his writings out on the table, and here, he said, just two questions. Are you the author of these writings? He looks, I am. Do you recant? That is, take back what you said. He said, what? I came down here to explain my beliefs. And they said, no, you can't talk. Answer the question. Are these your works? Yes. Do you take them back? Do you recant? And he says, I can't do that. Some of it, if I took this back, I'd be taking back accepted Christian belief. A lot of these are about moral actions in the life of Christians. I can't take that back. He does attack the corrupt leaders. But they said, we said all you're supposed to say is yes or no. Do you take it back or not? And he's just, and so the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, who's sitting up there, Charles, they turn to him and they, give him another day. Give him one more day. So he goes back, spends the night, all night evidently in prayer, he says. And he comes back the next day, same deal. Are these your works? Yes. Do you recant them? Do you take them back? And he's calm. Apparently there were eyewitnesses. Quite a number of folks were on his side throughout in the diet and in the audience. And he basically says this is an eyewitness account. Unless I am convinced by the testimony of the Scriptures and by clear reason, for I do not trust in the Pope or councils, since it is well known that they have often erred and contradicted themselves, I am bound by the Scriptures. My conscience is captive to the Word of God. I cannot and will not retract anything, since it is neither safe nor right to go against conscience. Here I stand. I cannot do otherwise. God help me. Amen. Now he had been given safe passage to come to him. So that means he was protected. Nobody was supposed to catch him. But at this point, the emperor says he is outlaw. He is to be hunted down and killed by anybody. He is condemned by government and church. He has some friends who get him out, and things develop over time where he basically is now seen as the beginner of what will become the Protestant Reformation. By the time you get to the 1600s, He nails the 95 Theses on October the 31st, 1517. 500 years ago, 2 years ago. 500 years, 2 years ago. It's the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. And by the time you get to 1600, you've got lands that are Lutheran in their belief. You've got another movement that has taken place in Switzerland with John Calvin, the Calvinist or Reformed movement, as well as Lord Zwingli. You've got the Anglican movement, which is a Protestant movement. You've got, of course, Roman Catholics continue to be in existence in several places. When you start getting into the Eastern Empire, you get to the Muslim people by the Ottoman Empire, but you also have mixed areas with mixed Catholic and Protestant lands. And the Council of Trent is a Catholic council that condemns Protestantism and defines Catholicism until the 1960s. Folks, Catholics were fighting Protestants. Lutherans were fighting Reformed and Catholics. There are a series of wars that take place over about 150 years. From the 1540s through even before that, but through the 1650s and 60s, millions of people died. Most of them not even combatants. What is going on? Would you say that somebody has missed the point of Christianity? Marburg Colloquy, Luther has a big fight with Ulrich Zwingli, who's another Protestant, but they disagree over the nature of the Lord's Supper, and they write mean tracts against each other, condemning each other, Christians condemning each other. Again, we don't do that kind of stuff today, right? No. Luther calls Zwingli some ugly names. There was another group called the Anabaptists who said, we don't think that the church and the state should be together. Christians should be believers. Only believers can be baptized because infant baptism had been practiced, which melds the church and the state. The Anabaptists, everybody hated them because they're not loyal to any government. The Catholics burned them at the stake. Their fellow Protestants, so to speak, drowned them. Said, you want baptism? We'll give you baptism.
No.
I'm going to stop at that point. Let me just ask you again, in groups of 2 or 3, what do you think is significant from this stuff for us in our faith today? What are the lasting implications of these things in our faith today? 3 minutes. I want to hear from people who didn't speak the first time. All right, let's come back together as a group of the whole, please. Let's come back together as a group of the whole. 3 hands of people who have not yet spoken in the full group. Again, not what you said, but what you heard someone else say that you thought was good as far as an implication, the significance of these events for today. Number 1. All night. Number 2. Number 3. John.
Yeah, my wise colleague, she was saying how, like, you can see that this sort of thing, it's there's something in us that keeps doing this to this day. We still do it. And then she was kind of reflecting on how, well, you can see that actually that doesn't benefit the gospel or the message or the identity or the just who we are and how people perceive us. This just hurts. And so it's important to us or to me, and yet I guess there's those priorities that you keep mentioning as well. It damages the priorities.
Yeah, I mean, people who don't know anything about Christianity see this as just, these are all supposedly followers of Christ. And they're fighting each other, in some cases literally. Number 2.
Hey, at least we don't kill each other today.
Sometimes, yeah.
Mostly. Here, anyway. Just looking at it and seeing what still happens today, is the real struggle it is to actually come and talk about these things. How difficult it is where you've got your beliefs and again you talk about the lens of what I grew up with and this is what it is, to actually sit there and talk with somebody else who has a different thing and no, because this is the way it is. And that becomes that is a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah, I think that you're exactly right. You pointed out something that's so crucial. We again, if we're not aware, number 1, that we have experiences, ways that have shaped us. Even the way that we approach the scriptures has been shaped in certain kinds of ways. If we're not aware that we have that, then we can make our ideas, our conclusions absolutized, make them equal to the point of Christianity, or make them the point of Christianity. And you definitely see that happening. Good. And number 3, yes, Paul.
As Luther gave his final at his judgment, we see his individualistic mindsets. He writes things to oppose what the corrupted leaders did, but his individualistic ideas and claim from the scriptures passed over to the next generation. Anyone can stand up with his individualistic interpretations and claim of scriptures and affect the whole
Very
society.
good. Very good. I think you've really pointed out an attitude that has become that. I mean, it's not that it wasn't there before, but it becomes very dominant, and later on, especially because when you come to a certain way of understanding how you know anything anyway, if there's this truth that's there and you use right reason to get to it, then everybody else is going to have to come to that same conclusion. And again, I think that one of the is there truth? Yes. Is there a point to being right with God? Yes. I want to be right. But I think what I would say is that it reinforced, all of this reinforced the notion that was already there in the minds of many, that what makes a Christian is a matter of assenting to or coming to an intellectual agreement with a set of doctrinal propositions rather than living a life transformed by Christ. A life that's characterized by the fruit of the Spirit. Now, again, I'm not saying the doctrine is unimportant. I'm saying it's not the end. It is not the point. It is to get us to the point. And so the things that they're fighting about are not inconsequential in the sense that, oh, it doesn't make any difference. You believe what you want to believe, I believe what I want to believe. And we also, you were getting at something that I think is really important too. We also think that we can't sit down and talk with people who have other ideas because they're not legitimate. They don't really love Christ at all. And they're wrong, and therefore I'm not even going to sit down and talk to them. Again, if we're not aware of our own lenses, our arrogance can take over and our exclusivism can take over. Does it mean that you have to compromise your beliefs? No. I believe that we should, and this is hard, we should be able to state what we believe and why we believe it and what we think would be lost if we did not believe it. But we should be willing to sit down with those who might not take that exact position and to talk, assuming the honesty and the goodwill of the other person rather than assuming the bad will and dishonesty of those people. Quite frankly, I think I have a lot to learn. So I think that it reinforces that idea that what makes an authentic Christian is assent to, agreement with a set of doctrinal propositions rather than a life being transformed into the image of Christ. And it's set in place, look at this folks, it's set in place divisions that are here to this day. All of these various divisions plus a whole lot more get translated around the world in the mission. We're going to go. Yes, I'm sorry.
I was just thinking, like Paul said, I can't remember but who's for Apollos,
Yes.
It goes even way back to them, doesn't it?
It really does.
And I was thinking of that saying, divide to conquer. And really, we have to remember that our enemy, the enemy of God, so busy at that time.
Absolutely.
And he's still busy using that history to confuse people.
That's right.
Because a lot of people will say, I'm not interested in it.
Absolutely.
Because of that.
Exactly.
And I think the major's walked out tonight because I don't think you're going to see the violence, associated with what, Christ is all about, which is love, kindness, that sort of, it's very confusing for people.
It really is, and Christians are guilty of having missed the point of what Christianity is all about. And here's the final one. We're going to go quickly through this. In 1910, people from every one of those religious groups that we just saw, plus a whole lot more, who were involved in taking the gospel in the 19th century and now in the 20th century to places that didn't know anything about Christ, primarily Africa, Asia, primarily those two places. And what they were finding, especially in the 19th century, was they would go to a place where the people know nothing about Christ, nothing about the church. And they're teaching them about Christ, and they should accept Christ, and that they should model their lives after Christ. And they said, okay, which Christian group should we go to? Because over here there's a Methodist church, and over there's a Presbyterian church, and over here's an Anglican church, and over there's a Catholic church, and over here's a Disciple or Baptist church. Which church is it? And the missionaries were talking ugly about the other missionaries who were not part of their group. And a lot of these people said, we don't get it, we don't want it. In 1910, a lot of missionaries from agencies, missionaries, and from mission agencies of a lot of different religious bodies throughout Europe, it was primarily Europe at this point, came together in Edinburgh, Scotland, and they said, this is a scandal. The division of Christianity is a scandal. It is a witness to our unfaithfulness to the call of Christ to be one. It is a witness to our unfaithfulness of the statement that is the truth of Ephesians chapter 4, there is one body. What can we do? the scandal of division of Christians is hindering mission work. It is hindering the taking of the gospel to people who know nothing about it. And they came together and they struggled with it. A lot of what they talked about at Edinburgh in 1910 had to do with taking the gospel and not so much Western culture. I mean, missionaries would go into places and they would make people wear certain clothes, and they would build church buildings. It looked like the church buildings back home in Europe or America. They would teach them these English songs instead of using the language and songs that they had. That was one thing that they talked about. It's got to be indigenous. Christianity is true and right and works in every culture, in every language, in every time. You don't have to be a European or an American to be a Christian. They talked about the fact that Western imperialism had been too much mixed in with the church. That there were a lot of folks throughout the centuries who were more interested or just as interested in having access to markets to sell stuff in these countries as they were taking the gospel. I mean, it's a mixed bag here. And so they began to say, we've got to stop these things. We've got to do some things that are different. And this is what begins. And I know for a lot of folks, and growing up myself, I would have seen this as a negative word. I would have seen this as something to oppose. In fact, I was told to oppose it. But I'm going to give you the word anyway, because it is a historical term. The ecumenical movement. The word ecumenical is just simply a Greek-rooted word that means universal. It's just trying to say, there is one body, folks. We don't make it. God made it. We messed it up as far as the visible unity of that one body. We messed it up, and we've got to do something about it. And so, the ecumenical movement, and there's a lot that we could talk about, I'll just mention a few things. There began to be councils of churches in different countries around the world. In the U.S. it was 1908 first. Missionary Conference, World Missionary Conference in 1910. In 21, the International Missionary Council sort of becomes an ongoing consulting group to say, what can we do to come together and to work together to take the gospel to people around the world. After World War I, devastation, millions of people died, and the Christians began to say, we have got to come together to help people who are dying of hunger and don't have places to live and don't have clothes. We've got to do this for people around the world as well as in Europe. And so they began what's called the Life and Work movement. In 27, people began to say, yes, we do need to help people in these ways. That's what Christ would do. But we also need to look at doctrine, the things that we teach, because that's what a lot of times keeps us apart. That's the faith. And the order, the way we structure our churches. Some churches have bishops, some churches have elders or presbyters, some churches are very congregational, some have big structures. We've got to look at these things because these are the dividing issues. And so the faith and order movement comes into existence. And then these three organizations, the International Missionary Council, the Life and Work movement, and the Faith and Order movement, come together finally in 1948 to form what's called a World Council of Churches. And I know there are a lot of folks, and I was one of them, who would have said, World Council of Churches, they're not even faithful Christians. I beg to differ. I have seen some of the most dedicated, Christ-shaped, fully willing to give almost everything of their own Christians who are part of this. There are other Christians who denounce them. And I understand that. And there are a lot of things that we can talk about there as well. But that's part of what happens in the ecumenical movement. It's an effort. It's not to form one big giant world church. Some people have said that was the goal, and that's not the goal. They're trying to get Christians to sit down with each other and say, what do we believe in common, and what can we do in common in the name of Jesus Christ to serve the world? Some of the fruit of this movement, we talked about Luther and Zwingli, that's the Reformed and Lutheran church. They got into it. They fought. They got into it so bad that the Reformed and Lutheran churches were separated until 1997, and they finally said, you know, we didn't like each other, and so we were putting words into each other's mouths. And when we actually look at what we teach, we actually are saying the same thing in different words. In 1999, the Catholics and the Lutherans, we read some of the document in our class yesterday or today, it was yesterday. They said, you know, they're not saying we're now becoming one church. They're saying we still have a lot of differences and we've got to sit down and talk with each other about that. But after 40 years of talking, Catholic leaders and Lutheran leaders in 1999 said the one big doctrine that separated us was how we believed in justification. How are you justified? How do you get salvation? The Lutherans said, it's by faith only. Christ did every bit of the work. You don't add anything to what Christ did. And the Catholics were saying, no, works contribute. At least that's what they thought they were saying. When they got together and after 40 years of conversation, they said, you know, we believe the same thing. You don't add anything to the work of Christ. Christ did everything. You can't, you know, it's not like Christ did 95% and so you add your 5% and then you get it, right? No. Nothing that you do can add to the work of Christ. Nothing that you do gives you merit that says, okay, I got to give it to them because they did so good. It is the work of Christ. It is faith in the work of Christ. The Catholics had emphasized the fact that works are important. And they said, but we believe, like you do, that it's only the work of Christ. But we believe that works come out of the life that's committed to Christ. And the Lutherans said, well, we do. The Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification, that's JDDJ. It's an amazing document. And they say that doesn't say that we don't have a lot of disagreements still. But with this resolved, we can sit down with each other and continue to talk. And they are. Even in our Churches of Christ, Stone Campbell Dialogue began in the year 2000 talking about how people from our own movement can come together. And you know, the Anabaptists, we showed you the picture about the Anabaptists being drowned by the Lutherans. The Anabaptists were they were outlaws by everybody. Everybody hated them. And the Anabaptists in turn condemned everybody too. They said the Catholic Church is an abomination and all the other Protestants are abominations too. In 2010, a large group of Lutherans connected to what's called the Lutheran World Federation, and a large group of Mennonites, one of the largest Anabaptist groups in the world today, connected with the Mennonite World Conference, met in a city in Germany, and they've been talking to each other for a while too. We watched a video about this the other day, and they repented to each other. The Anabaptist leader got up there and he said, you know, we can't walk it. He's an African. There are more Anabaptists in Africa than there are anywhere else now. In fact, there are more Christians of almost every name in Africa than anywhere else. In churches, there are a lot more churches of Christ in Africa than there are in the United States or Europe or New Zealand or Australia. He's an African, and he said, we can't walk in here. We Mennonites can't walk in here with our heads held high. We weren't killing you guys, you Lutherans, but we were condemning you. We were calling you an abomination. And that was wrong. The Lutherans said we were wrong to kill our brothers and sisters. And they had a ceremony of repentance where the Lutherans washed the feet of the Mennonites and repented of what they'd done to them. There are a lot of other examples of this kind of thing happening. Partly because of this emphasis on the ecumenical movement. Again, some people say the ecumenical movement is about compromising our faith and not standing for anything. That's not true. The ecumenical movement began because the division among Christians was a scandal to the non-Christian world, and it hindered the advance of the gospel. The dominant religions, now this is a little bit misleading because there are lots of things you'd have to say, but the dominant religions, as you can see from this map supposedly, are Christianity, the purple Sub-Saharan Africa is dominantly Christian. Islam is very strong in the northern part. But I want to show you a short video and then we'll be done. The fact of the matter is, like I said, the center of Christianity today is Africa. Christianity has become, since the 20th century especially, a global religion. And let's face it, folks, there are exceptions with congregations in New Zealand and Australia and the United States, but most of the churches in Christianity in New Zealand and Australia and the United States, the numbers are going down. Not going down in Africa. They're apparently not going down in China. Our son Mark lives in China and he knows from his own personal contact of thousands and thousands of Christians, even though technically many of them are illegal because their churches are not registered. Christianity is no longer a Western religion. Watch this short video.
It is said of us when we leave this place that we have come to turn the world upside down for you. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.
Perhaps we need to set things a bit in context. As we prayed about turning the world upside down. This map of the world's religions and missions is now outdated. See, the pink shading shows where the Christians are, but that's where they were. And the darker shading shows where the non-Christians are. If we're to remake this map at the end of the 20th century, we will shade the pink along here and shade the other colors and the heathen colors here.
I was a student of French studies in the heyday of the 60s, you know, student demonstrations and agitations, and I was kind of part of that culture. What I think happened to me really was a sudden realization that living my life, constructing my life without any reference to the transcendent, in fact, was a flawed outlook.
It was the summer of 70. I come to a point in my life. I had done well academically. Everything was going for me, as I was saying, in modern language. And yet, there was this bit of futility within, which caused me to begin to review my life. Suddenly, it occurred to me, I come to a dead end. And I think I remember saying something to this effect. God, I'm tired, take my life. Now, I didn't pray, I didn't know what God I was talking to. Instead, what happened was, I literally crumpled under the shower. I didn't turn on the tap, yet I felt a drop on my foot. It was a tear. Then somehow, I felt flooding into me a newness of life. Quickly got out, had my shower, went back to my apartment room, and I'd never done this ever before. I spent half of that night in prayer. I wish to define myself as a Christian, as an African Christian, not because a European has told me so. Indeed, my exposure to Europe made me atheist. In becoming Christian, 33 years ago, in France, on my own, under the shower, in the summer break, on the campus of University of Bordeaux, I discovered I was becoming African again. I was recovering my sense of the spirituality of life. I was recovering my sense of the nearness of the living God. I was recovering my African sense of the wholeness of life. I find in becoming Christian, I'm being more African than I think I was. I'm being more who I am.
All of the places that we're talking about Christianity growing are places that believe in a world that we don't believe in, but which the New Testament writers did. A world of active spiritual reality. We have, in our enlightened day, explained that away. Kwame Bediako, brilliant African Christian theologian. He says, I'm actually, as a Christian, I'm more African than I was before, because Africans see all of life as part of the spiritual reality. He's a Christian now. He's not an animist. He believes that Christ can overcome the evil spirits. The same thing is true in Africa. The same thing is true in Latin America. They see a wholeness to life, a reality of a spiritual world that exists that most of us in the West don't buy. Since our time is gone, I'll just give you my sense of what's important about this turning point where mission work sparked by a desire for Christians to come together and cooperate and spread the gospel has such a major impact. I see four things. There are more professing Christians in Africa at the beginning of the 21st century than in the Western world combined. That's the US, Australia, Europe, New Zealand, Canada, all combined. There are more Christians in Africa. Two, the nations that send more missionaries to other countries around the globe, including the United States and Europe, that is, the United States and Europe are getting missionaries from Brazil and South Korea. And also many African missionaries, even to the United States. Number three, the new Christians of the Global South do not embody Christianity in ways Westerners have come to expect in the modern era. Their worldview and their worship style is not what we're comfortable with. And they are influencing, for good, the world. And number four, the increasing clashes with Islam. And you can see, even on this map, the areas where predominantly Christian and predominantly Islamic, there are increasing clashes, particularly with Islamic extremists. But I'll tell you, Linda and I were in Ghana just a few years ago. And in the northern part of Ghana, there's a significant Islamic population. And the Christians had gone into that area and had, because of some drought and some bad conditions, had dug wells for the Islamic people. They just served them because they wanted to serve them in the name of Christ. That did more for good relations. In fact, there was a wedding. One of the people who had come and dug a well, and they were down in Accra, which is down on the coast. And so they're having a wedding at the church building at the Nswam Road Church. And one of the largest congregations, Churches of Christ in Ghana, it's 2,000 members. So they've got the wedding party and it's starting up. And suddenly, the wedding's already started. And suddenly, 5 buses pull up outside. And all of these people begin piling out of the buses. It was some of those Islamic people from northern Ghana who said, we heard about the wedding and we wanted to come and honor you and show our love for you. And they're thinking, oh no, the wedding's already started and we've already got the front rows filled. The people on the front row, the Christians, got up and moved and let the Islamic folks come and take the front row. The conflicts are real, but when you treat each other like people who are people of God, that is, created by God, they're creatures of God, those kinds of things begin to change. and you see it in many cases. If you want more information, these are 3 really good books. Luis Gonzalez is 2 volumes. Turning Points, the book I mentioned, and then Church History in Plain Language. That's a really good one too. They're all easy reads if you want more stuff. Also, there's a number of Christian history magazines that are really great materials. They're free online. www.christianhistoryinstitute.org/magazine. Tons and tons of great material if you wanted to read more about specific things. There are well over 100 magazines that you can get online free now. There's a really good one on Martin Luther. And Alexander Campbell, one of the leaders that began the Churches of Christ. We got maybe, do we have 30 seconds for Q&A, or is it too late?
If you open the floor up, we'll find out.
Let's take 5 minutes. If you have a comment or a question, if not, we'll go have some refreshments. Comment or question? Warwick.
It's interesting over the years, I've heard this word so many times, denomination, or non-denomination.
Yes.
What does that mean?
The term denomination becomes common in the 19th century. It simply means, and it really was an attempt to say, we're not saying you're not Christians, we're saying you are this kind of Christian. So you are denominated or you are named. I remember when I was really little, I'd been at church. We heard all this talk, against the denominations. Denominations are wrong. I didn't know what they were talking about. They just assumed everybody knew what they were talking about. And I asked my mother, "What's a denomination?" And she said, "It's like a 10-cent coin or a 25-cent coin. This is a 10-cent denomination. That's 25 cents." Why are they talking against that in church? It didn't make any sense to me. Well, the term actually was meant to be something to say, you are Christians, you're just of a different name. But it also is an attitude. The reality is that. The reality is that. Go down the road, and you've got the Odomoti Baptist Church. You go this direction, you have the Odomoti Church of Christ. You go over there, and you have the Anglican Church. Okay? Those are named groups. Each one has a history, a set of doctrines, a set of shared experiences. It's just the truth. It's just the way it is. But there's an attitude that goes along with it, and especially in the context of the Stone Campbell movement that produced Churches of Christ in the early days, they were not against the reality of people having histories and names and ways of thinking. They were against the attitude that says that's okay to be separate. It's okay to continue on as if I don't exist. And that perpetuates the scandal of division among Christians. That's what they were opposed to. So how do we overcome the attitude of denominationalism that says, it's all right, you do your thing, we'll do our thing, we're not going to go blow your building up, but we're not going to have anything to do with you. I guess toleration is better than intolerance. Actually, tolerance is a virtue, but it is the lowest of all virtues. Because you tolerate, it means you don't really care to know anything really about the other. It's when you move up the ladder, so to speak, of virtues that you begin to try to understand and to respect and to know and to have relationship with and to actually appreciate. And so how do you do that? And that's what the ecumenical movement, in its best forms at least, is trying to say. There are ways that we can do this without compromising our beliefs. Thanks. What else? Anybody else? Yes.
I just want to say thank you so much for this teaching. I just didn't understand why, I'm from Zimbabwe anyway, why Zimbabwe was really a Catholic church dominant country. I was brought up Catholic and 80% Catholics.
Yes.
I just wondered why.
Yes, yes.
It's quite interesting why. Now I understand that the missionaries which came to Zimbabwe were Catholics. And my parents are still Catholics, but I'm no longer a Catholic. But I always ask questions. I'm trying to convince my mom about the true gospel that we are bought by the blood of Jesus Christ and Christ alone. and through Jesus Christ our sins are forgiven. I don't need to go to a priest and say, Father, give me 10 Hail Marys or whatever.
Right.
I just need to go to God Himself and forgive my sins. And thank you for that. Now I understand so much. The other point is that I'm married to a Muslim. We are both from Zimbabwe. Thank you for that. It has helped me so much. I'll take it back and just being nice and looking at him with the image of Christ, who will draw him to Christ.
Yes.
And I see my place to judge or to try to push him. I always criticize, not criticize, but talk about him about
Yeah.
but now I'll stop from now on because yes, it was really good for that kind of teaching.
Well, thank you so much for that.
Thank you for that.
I think that, again, it is so easy for Christians to miss the point of Christianity. The temptation is so strong, the tendency is so strong to make the point a set of propositions. Again, I'll say it again. I've said it 3 or 4 times, and I say it every day in class, in church history class. I'm not saying the doctrine's not important. I'm saying it's not the point. The point is being transformed into the image of Christ and to be characterized by the fruit of the Spirit, which is love, joy, and peace, and patience, and gentleness, and all the things that are spoken of in Galatians chapter 5. And as we are being transformed from one degree of glory to another, as Paul says to the Corinthians, we become more and more like Christ. And that's the way I think that's the key to evangelization. And how we deal with the realities of denominationalism, that's a thing that I think we have to wrestle with and not be complacent about. Let's pray and then we'll be done. Gracious God, we're so thankful for your love for us. We're thankful for you giving us everything good that we have. I'm so thankful for each one who's here tonight. We have a glorious heritage of people who have loved you and have honored your name, have struggled to follow you imperfectly, even as we do. Continue to work in our hearts and minds to transform us more and more into the image of Christ. Be with us through this night, keep us safe, and in your love. Through Christ we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Dave. We appreciate that. Let's show our appreciation.